Hello and welcome to the next lecture, lecture 9. And this is about the consolidation of the various medical measures that the British had undertaken. So, we have been seeing how the British had initial misgivings and how they developed confidence in settling down themselves. And of course, it's not about uh, just about them alone. So, health came to be one of the important pillars of the entire colonial enterprise. So, therefore, there was a need for constant attention to health and disease and medical topography and every kind of effort. So, health would always be an important component element of the colonial enterprise. So, in this lecture, we are going to see how, so in the early days, they consolidated some of the health measures, including setting up of medical schools, new medical departments, the gradual opening up to public health from enclavism. So, these are kinds of things we will be considering in this lecture and the next couple of lectures. And as I have been mentioning in several lectures, so 1857 was the watershed moment, and after that, there were all kinds of new concerns, and naturally, new concerns about health and about health of the British in particular, and even generally. So, therefore, there are new efforts to improve sanitation, medical facilities, and public health. So, that is a key word we will be, especially since in the last lecture we were talking about enclavism. So, we can see it in a sense as two contrasting things. So, enclavism versus public. So, some of this include the establishment of medical schools to train Indian doctors within India. So, this will of course be the subject of a separate lecture, which is medical education. And then we see the embryonic public health infrastructure taking shape to combat diseases like cholera and malaria. So, many of which were taking epidemic proportions, so some of them used to be endemic, and as they were becoming epidemic, as we will see from time to time how some of these became epidemic due to some of the features of colonialism itself. But whatever the reason, so these are diseases which could no longer, given the size, the dimensions that they were taking, so these were diseases which could not be taken very lightly. So, apart from widening curative processes, there was also the development of preventive medicine. And in all of these things, there was a huge influence of European medical professionalism, medical professionals, their training back home in England, then all the baggage of their cultural and intellectual, academic, professional background had their influence here. So, many Western practices were deployed in the Indian context, and some of the very specific technicalities, instrumentalities, departments which were introduced include the coming of the provincial medical boards in the provinces in the 1780s. And so, medicine was one of the fields which acquired a bureaucratic character quite early on. So, the bureaucratic structure ensured that it had its own hierarchy, its clear set of rules and procedures, service rules and conduct rules, all that. But of course, that shouldn't lead one to believe that the state was very much proactive and took upon itself the role of public health in a very proactive manner. So that is a question mark which we will see throughout the course. So that is not how it turned out to be. So we will see in the or series of lectures about the various reasons the state was not so proactive. But coming back to the technicalities, so in each presidency there were 2 or 3 senior surgeons who very bureaucratically regulated the appointments. They maintained discipline and directed general policy. And there was, of course, constant effort to improve the efficiency of the system, the bureaucratic system. So there were all kinds of new posts introduced, or the nomenclatures being changed, or the nature of their responsibilities being changed. So, for instance, the post of Provincial Director General was introduced, and that was later changed to Inspector General or Surgeon General. So, these took the place of the medical boards, which we were referring to in the previous slides. So, in 1857, so this was the new change. Then provincial sanitary commissioners were introduced in the 1860s. So which again, so sanitary measures, or so when you think of sanitary measures, so immediately what comes to mind is that it's one of the most important dimensions of public health. So when we talk about sanitary commissioners, so again, that is an indication of at least the state's commitment or expectation that the state would be having a firm leg in public health. But the problem with the sanitary commission or the commissioners is that they had no executive powers, so they were more advisory. So they could make studies and produce reports, but not having much of executive powers. So at the central level too, there was a sanitary commissioner, just as in the province. And what are the other things that happened in this march towards public health from enclavism was the constant efforts, as I said. So there was a particular focus on preventive medicine. So there were so many efforts at disease prevention through various tools like vaccination and improvement of sanitation and general hygiene. So which means that these had significant consequences for the Indian population. So that's why we have to keep in mind, as much as medicine was an important pillar in colonialism, similarly, as far as the colonized were concerned, so medicine was an important avenue through which the colonial power exercised its influence in a very direct way. So, for instance, so here in terms of sanitation or in terms of medication, for instance, Indians were subject to lots of trials and experimentation. So there were concerns about medical practices in Indian bodies. So for instance, vaccination, the white man touching Indian bodies and putting alien things into Indian bodies, and how far was it compatible with pre-existing Indian systems and Indian customs, and what are the kinds of cultural consequences that might leave. So these are interesting questions which we will be unveiling in the next set of lectures. And the effectiveness of all of these measures, so whatever we are talking about, whether it's sanitary commissioners or provincial boards or whatever bureaucratic structures, so all of these depended on certain crucial variables. So one of which was the availability of resources and the state's willingness to use those resources, especially the financial resources, which we will see the state was not too keen to do. And of course, the state might have policies, but it was also the success was very much dependent on the cooperation and interest of the colonial officials at different levels, and most of all, the engagement of the local communities. So either the larger populace itself, or the intermediaries, the opinion makers or popular leaders who could play important intermediary roles. So that was another important factor, how far they could be convinced, how far they could be expected to have influence on the larger population. So that leads us to reasonably assume that Indians had more significant roles. So, for instance, at different levels, as I said, so officials, Indian officials in the sanitary and presidency services played a very crucial part in implementing public health policies and initiatives. And of course, as we have been insisting, there's always that element of racism, consciousness of race and superiority, all those kinds of racial and cultural barriers, which we will be continuously discussing in different dimensions in different subsequent lectures. And in course of time, as part of the larger political unfolding, as part of granting of concessions in response to the rising spirit of nationalism, there was room open for Indians to be part of legislatures. So there are many Indians who were elected at different levels. So they also could play an important role in shaping the public health direction. And many of these policies and practices which evolved in the colonial period had a lasting legacy, which we will be seeing, especially towards the last few lectures. We will be particularly highlighting this point, the enduring influence of some of these kinds of measures, these kinds of institutions, this kind of bureaucratic structure, the effect of all these on subsequent development of the medical infrastructure, medical policy, which continue to this day. And one of the most important instrumentalities or set of institutions in this consolidation of the health measures is the opening of Sanatoria, and especially hill-based Sanatoria. So, medical studies of hill stations and other salubrious localities became an important component of topographical studies and reports, and they even formed part of the medical journalism. So, there was a favorable depiction of hill stations and hill station lifestyles, which of course contrasted with the hardships and challenges of life in general for Europeans in India and the plains. So this kind of projection of the virtues of hill station was aimed at helping the European civilians who were anxious to escape the heat and disease of the plains. And this, as I keep repeating, was particularly pronounced after 1858, when there was increased concern about attracting more Englishmen, and especially with their families. So even if you are not settling in the hills permanently, which of course some people did, for instance, planters who had settled more or less permanently in the hills. So even if you are not doing that, but at least so hill stations were a good option for temporary recuperation. So to go from time to time, especially when you feel the body needs that revitalization, or what was called the regaining of the European vitality. And of course, the interest in hills also had other motivations. So hills were also sites for other projects like forestry, scientific forestry, tapping of timber, and of course opening up of plantations like tea, coffee, and rubber, different crops which thrived at different altitudes in the hills. And of course, hills were also sites for summer capital. For instance, so Shimla is the summer capital for the entire British establishment. Or, for instance, in the Madras Presidency, Uttakamand, what in short is called Uti, so would be the summer capital of the Madras Presidency. So the entire establishment would move from Madras to Uti. So hills had different kinds of utilities, and from a climate and health point of view, so it was a site for general refreshing, a break, a recreation or a holiday, and of course for some post-retirement settling. So we have cases of some authors who settled up the hills. And so even more specifically from a medical point of view, so hills and the hill stations were sites of medical establishments like sanatoria and research stations. So we'll be having a special lecture on research stations and research institutes where we'll be coming back to the hills. But talking about sanatoria and generals, of course, a sanatoria is again a place where of course, it's a place which is, of course, directly related to health, regaining vitality, or places which are meant for rehabilitation. So they need not be necessarily in the hills. So it can be any place where any of these things happen. It's recuperation or rehabilitation or regeneration. So it can be in the plains also. So so the aim was to relocate troops away from unhealthy living conditions, or from their diseased states, or from particularly dangerous places, to have a special kind of care and attention and regeneration. So so as I said earlier, so coming here and then having identified so very salubrious, very temperate areas is all fine, but then it's practically impossible to settle down all of them in such areas. So the medical board advocated a system of sending troops in rotation to the hill stations. So, for instance, the Nilgiris in the south and Himalayas in the north were popular destinations for setting up hill sanatoria. So, and of course, so these were particularly useful for recuperating the health sick and disabled troops, and especially to bring down the high levels of mortality and morbidity among the European troops. But of course, so all this on the face of it sounds very bright and unproblematic from a strictly climate or particularly temperature point of view, but there were all kinds of difficulties. So one is, of course, again, if considerable proportion of the troops is stationed in the hills in higher altitudes, then there's a problem in responding to say 1857 or even smaller versions of such kinds of uprising in plains or other areas far from these kinds of sanatoria. So that is why the system of rotation was proposed. So only 1/3 of the total force to be garrisoned in the hills, which is a very small number compared to the what was contemplated by the 1859 Royal Commission on Sanitary State of the Indian Army. And of course, there are other kinds of problems, very specifically related. Of course, these problems which you just mentioned were related to practical, tactical issues. But these are problems related to the core issue of climate and its relationship to factors of health. So hill stations did not always mean salubriousness. Of course, there were salubrious aspects, but then the same elevation can also have counter effects, effects on the opposite direction. Especially, there were numerous examples of elevated positions, especially those which rose abruptly from alluvial or jungle covered tracks. So they had particular health issues. So, for instance, more chances of succumbing to diseases like malaria. And so, even such exalted places like Darjeeling, which is one of the hailed as one of the queens of the hills, with, of course, it's also famous for its tea. But even beyond tea, so places like Darjeeling and Nainital, they're supposed to be like class hill stations. So even they were thought to be very unhealthy because of some empirical findings. For instance, the high rate of diarrhea and dysentery in these kinds of places. But all said and done, hill stations definitely played a very crucial role in alleviating the fear of survival. At least they could have an immediate escape in the vicinity without having to go back home, which itself would take a lot of time and anything could happen on the way. So, at least relatively speaking, so it was these kinds of opportunities were available in relative vicinity to escape the heat and humidity of the plains. And with their bungalows, clubs, and gardens, because hill stations were not just about the hills and some kind of enclosed spaces with better climate and health benefits. A whole lot of other things, cultural elements went up the hills, like these telltale signs of hill stations, like these bungalows and clubs. So they became special centers of social and cultural life for the British in India. And also, this was also a place to be filled with a sense of nostalgia. As I said, that's going home for regaining the tropical ambience was not an easy option. So, as I said, so there was a huge separation of the seas and distance, and anything could happen on the way. So, these were places within the tropics where you could have some sense of rediscovery. So, one of the ways of doing it was to consciously plant here the kinds of plants, the kinds of fruits, the strawberries, raspberries, and other kinds of things, particular kinds of flowers, the hollies, and other kinds of making of hedges and other kinds of things. So, it should promote that sense of nostalgia, the sense of home away from home. So, that element was also there. So, it was not just about some sense of recuperation and some sense of break and all that. So, it was also kind of rediscovering home away from home. So, that way, these were so apart from military strategic elements, apart from plantation, forestry kind of attributes, so there's a whole lot of cultural aspects to the creation of these hill stations from apart from, of course, a medical point of view. But all said and done, so this is not something that everyone could afford to go. So hill stations were there, but then so there were limitations apart from all the other limitations we have talked about. So the limitations were on the part of the people who could afford to go. So even among the Westerners themselves, so the lower classes or lower levels of the military, they could not afford, so they had to be happy with, or they had to just experience the harsh climate of the plains for the most part. So these were some of the kinds of limitations in the exceptional areas. So this again you can consider as a different kind of enclave, totally different kind of enclaves. So all of them had, just as we saw, there were limitations with regard to those enclaves. So these kinds of sanatoria and hill stations had their own limitations from financial and strategic and from climate and health point of view as well, and which also we'll be visiting from time to time in future lectures. So bye for now.